Russia. And I'm delighted today to have introducing our two guests, one of our board members from Total, Elizabeth Matthews. Elizabeth is Deputy Managing Director, Executive Vice President, and General Counsel at Total. Elizabeth, thank you so much for joining us.
Sure, thank you, Ronan. So delighted to introduce our speakers for tonight. Peter Baker is the Chief White House Correspondent for the New York Times, a political analyst for MSNBC, and author of Days of Fire in the Breach. And Susan Glasser is a staff writer for The New Yorker and author of its weekly Letter from Trump's Washington, as well as a CNN Global Affairs analyst. Their first assignment as a married couple was as Moscow bureau chiefs for the Washington Post, after which they wrote Kremlin Rising. And thank you all for joining us, and I'll turn it back over to Ronan.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth, and thank you very much, Peter and Susan, for joining us. As Peter knows, we've hosted him before for other of your excellent books. I've been hounding you for 3 years. I was looking back at my emails today. Delighted to have you. I know this is an incredible book that took an awful lot of effort on both of your halves, especially considering your two powerful day jobs. So we're delighted to have both of you. And just as an aside, in case anybody's wondering, Peter, you are no relation to James Baker, correct?
True, but I am related to Susan Glasser, so it works out really well.
And it works out great for us too. You guys are an incredible power couple. There's so much here in the book, but maybe just to open it up, as you mentioned various times, he comes from an incredible family, and especially for our Houston audience, I think you'd really enjoy the early chapters about his great-grandfather, his grandfather, and his father, and really in a lot of ways how they shaped Houston. They were titans and shapers of Houston in ways people still appreciate today, Rice University being one of them. But both of them told him at different points in his life, stay out of politics. Relatively briefly, could you talk about how it is that James Baker, a corporate attorney who had taken his parents' and fathers and grandfathers' advice to stay out of politics, became such an influential figure and got to Washington? And perhaps, sadly, if it hadn't been for an awful tragedy in his life, that he may never have gone to DC at all.
Well, thank you so much for hosting us, and thank you to everyone for tuning in tonight. It's such a busy time, so we're really grateful to everyone for their interest. And I have to say, for Peter and I think that learning about Houston and learning about Baker's early years was, sort of one of the unexpected benefits of doing this project. And, we're familiar with Secretary Baker's, sort of glittering resume. In many ways, that's why we wanted to do the book, was to give people a sense of, sort of what was Washington like when Washington ran the world. From the end of Watergate to the end of the Cold War, Jim Baker really was a central figure in every Republican campaign and in all of the major policy fights and discussions of the day. So we already knew that going into the book. What we didn't know was, first of all, as you pointed out, how unlikely it was that he even ended up in politics. We discovered essentially that he's the world's most successful mid-career switch. He didn't get here until he was 40 years old to Washington. And those foundational early years, I don't know about many of you, but for me, I always like the first part of biographies better as a reader. And I found in many ways that I liked it better as a writer too, because, this really was what shaped Jim Baker. And what I learned in part is that you could see his entry into politics as not the logical conclusion of this privileged upbringing he had in Houston, but actually as an act of rebellion in some ways. You mentioned his father, grandfather, and great-grandfather were not just corporate lawyers who built what was at one time the largest law firm west of the Mississippi, Baker Botts, there in Houston, but they were also, they were institution builders and shapers of the modern city in many ways, especially his grandfather, known as Captain Baker. He was a turn of the century, sort of progressive era. He basically was the chairman of the board of everything in Houston, more or less, as far as I can tell. He was an original member of not one, but both country clubs. He founded the bank. And of course, most importantly, he founded and really was the patron of Rice University, which wouldn't really exist without the Baker family. And so we learned all of that in the course of trying to understand what made this very unique figure who was able to dominate both politics and policy. And for that, I think we had to look day to day to the role that his very strict and demanding father had on him. He was essentially a tough taskmaster. There's a real reason that Baker and his friends called Dad the Warden. And he, he was of the old school to the extent that he would pour cold water on him if he didn't get up early enough on a Saturday morning. And his ironclad rule was work hard, study hard, and stay out of politics. And so, it was a fascinating journey for us, I think, into the Houston of 100 years ago.
And I suppose, could you just discuss, how it was, first of all, himself and George Bush, 41, the father, obviously became incredible friends, and perhaps in a lot of ways, one of his closest friends. Baker, perhaps like Reagan, didn't have a lot of people he was extremely close to. But how it was that, as you mentioned in the book, when Bush first approached him, he said, well, first of all, George, I'm a Democrat, and second of all, I don't know anything about politics. How was it? Can you get us kind of relatively quickly through how this corporate lawyer from Houston ended up running the campaign for Ford, and then later, despite a loss, being seen as such an effective and just incredible, kind of facilitator in Washington, was chosen surprisingly to many by Reagan as for his chief of staff.
Yeah, it's an amazing story, and it really does show you how history is changed by small things, right? Meeting George Bush on the country club courts in Houston, tennis courts in Houston, becoming his doubles partner, arguably changed history, right? If that hadn't happened, he never would have become Secretary of State. It's arguable that if that hadn't happened, George Bush might not have become president, because in fact, Baker was obviously as important to Bush's career as Bush was to Baker. So you're right. So he had a terrible family tragedy. People in Houston may know this. His first wife dies of cancer in 1970. And the only person he tells when his wife is dying that she has this terminal diagnosis, the only person he confides in is George H.W. Bush. He doesn't even tell his wife, who of course knows. He doesn't tell his mother. He doesn't tell his kids. The person he talks to is George Bush. So that tells you how close they really are. And of course, in Houston, you guys see all the time those statues facing each other across the park, sort of, I think, symbolizing the power of their partnership. And it's Bush who launches him into politics, helps bring him to Washington, helps him get a job at the Commerce Department. But from there, it's Baker's own skill set that helps propel him into the top ranks of the White House. As Susan likes to point out, there was sort of a neutron bomb had gone off in the top levels of the Republican Party because of Watergate. So a young White House chief of staff named Dick Cheney pulls Baker out of the Commerce Department, says, hey, you got to run the delegate operation basically for the President of the United States at the convention. Does such a good job. He's called the Miracle Man by beating Reagan at that convention, and then goes on to take over the fall campaign, comes really close to coming back 30 points and beating Carter, falls a little short. As you point out real quickly to run through it, he then runs Bush's campaign in 1980, does well enough to get him onto the ticket with Reagan, and then Reagan picks him as chief of staff, which I think says so much about both Reagan and Baker, right? Baker had won not one, but two campaigns against Reagan, and yet Reagan thought, I need somebody who knows what they're doing to make this work, so I'm going to bring this Baker guy in.
And as you know repeatedly throughout the book, a lot of Reagan's base was relatively furious that they would bring in someone like Baker. Maybe you could talk about how they saw Bush. People always saw Bush Baker as if they're one person sometimes, but as seeing them as being far too moderate, far too kind of maybe country club Republicans instead of diehard Republicans.
Absolutely. That was the real tension inside the Republican Party. And also Bush, when he campaigned hard against Reagan in the primaries. And, the phrase voodoo economics was a phrase that George H.W. Bush used in attacking Ronald Reagan in that primary election. And actually, interestingly enough, Baker was already focused on the strategic goal of getting Bush a place on the ticket. And he was worried about that speech, and he was worried that they would hit Reagan too hard, or that they wouldn't get out soon enough and therefore would torpedo Bush's chances of getting on the ticket. And that's one of the interesting parts of it. So he already had his eye on the prize for his friend, but I think chief of staff was not something that he expected. And interestingly enough, it wasn't that Ronald Reagan came up with this idea of Jim Baker on his own. That's not how Reagan rolled. Obviously, he was pretty famously, and I think accurately, indifferent to some of the details. But what's interesting is that two of his close advisors, Stuart Spencer and Mike Deaver, came up with this scheme. They both later claimed authorship, reflecting the notion that success has 1,000 followers. right? But they teamed up on this idea basically because of their rival, their internal rival, Ed Meese, who was sort of the intellectual godfather in some ways of the Reagan Revolution and the conservative ideology that animated it. But in California, he had been, quite frankly, a disaster when it came to actually running things. They joked that his briefcase was the place where papers go to die. And so they just thought that if he was running the White House, that it would be a debacle. And so they gravitated towards Baker. They schemed even before Reagan's election victory in that November, even that fall, they were scheming to get Baker FaceTime with the candidate and to kind of socialize this idea, as it was said. But even when he was in the White House, when he was acquiring power, when he was really running the country in many ways, that suspicion dogged him. The slogan, many of you will remember, "Let Reagan be Reagan." In some ways, that was actually a response and a critique, implicit critique of Jim Baker and his influence. The idea that he really wasn't on board with the ideological program of the revolution.
And maybe just briefly, you could talk about it. I think obviously people know, in essence, the Secretary of State, what the role is: Secretary of Commerce, a campaign manager. Chief of Staff, as you note in the book, was only created, I think, during Eisenhower's presidency. Something he took from the military himself. Briefly, one way Baker sums it up is great. I think I'll use different language, less color, but he says, "My job is to stop the president from getting into trouble, and if he gets into trouble, getting him out." But more broadly, can you talk about what it is exactly a chief of staff does? Because I think a lot of people hear the term and know the term, but especially if they have a president who's willing to let them do it, they don't know how much influence and power a chief of staff can really have.
Yeah, that's exactly right. The phrase that Baker used, I won't use it either, but it was basically a poop detector with a more earthy version of that. That was his way of putting it. And I think that he saw the job. First of all, he made sure to say that it was important to remember that it was the important word in that title is staff, not chief, right? And he would tell all of his successors that. Every person who served White House Chief of Staff has called Jim Baker, I think, since then to say, how do you do it? Because they were looking for advice and looking to replicate his success. And he always told them that, remember, your staff, not chief. And in that, it meant that Reagan was the guy who was setting the vision. Now, it was up to Baker to figure out how to make it work. And it was Baker who, as chief of staff, decided, look, let's not waste time on the things that weren't going to be fruitful. We're not going to actually convince Congress, a Democratic House, to eliminate the Department of Education, even though that's what Reagan wanted to do. So let's put that to the side for now and focus on things we can get through: our economic program, our tax cuts, our spending cuts, things that had some resonance. So that was Baker's job, was to help shape Reagan's vision into an actual governing program. He was an engineer rather than an architect in that sense. And I think that the best chiefs of staff understood that was their job. Every president wants a little different. Every president handles it different. This particular president we've got in there now has made it very hard on his chiefs. Baker had it easy in the sense that Reagan wanted Baker to do the things he did.
And I think as you point out repeatedly in the book, Reagan definitely had a strong ideology, but he was also quite willing to work with Democrats. He had a famous relationship and friendship with Tip O'Neill. It's a friendship that might only start after office hours. But can you talk about maybe the influence that Baker himself had perhaps on Reagan? Because in a lot of ways, he was the one not necessarily driving the legislation, but making it happen. And early on, he said, social issues are not going to be our major issues for the first year you're in office. We're going to get the economy fixed. And you talk about maybe how much of an influence Baker was upon the kind of realities of Reagan and maybe helping him kind of reach areas of compromise.
Well, I think that's a good observation because, in the end, your record is your ideology. And he was trying to build a real fit between what he saw as the political imperatives for Ronald Reagan. Reagan had run against Jimmy Carter successfully, pointing out that the economy was in shambles and inflation was skyrocketing, and that they had really made a specific commitment to the American people. That was the laser-like focus that Baker brought, connecting the politics and the policy. But of course, that also tells you how much things have changed today. That the structural incentives of politics, Baker saw that the way to re-election was actually through making deals and assembling a record of accomplishment for the American people. And right now, of course, you have a situation where in both parties, there's almost an idea that governing has become subsidiary to a permanent campaign. And so, for Baker, you're right that he controlled the legislative agenda, and that became Reagan's political agenda. And, Baker was extremely good at understanding what the political load would bear, right? And you had to do that by working with the other party. That was just the simple reality. Democrats, after all, controlled the House of Representatives for 4 decades. So, that was seen as an immovable political fact. And Reagan, I think, was often misportrayed in later years as he became kind of Reagan the myth as opposed to Reagan the actual president, that he was a sort of inflexible ideologue. But in reality, Baker quotes him all the time as saying, I would rather get 80% of what I want than go over the cliff with my flag flying. And I think that it was reflected in a much more strategic and disciplined approach to policy that Baker brought to the White House.
And before we maybe get to kind of the end of the Reagan years, there's so much to cover since Baker's major influence in Washington and beyond and the rest of the world for so many years. But maybe we could just talk about the major economic accomplishments. Later as Secretary of Commerce, but before that, how it was that he was really the mastermind and the moderator and facilitator to be able to get Democrats and Republicans to all agree to a major tax reform that was acceptable to Reagan, but was also acceptable to O'Neill and Democrats.
Right, that's exactly. One of the big moments, I think, of his time in Washington was rewriting the tax code from top to bottom in tandem with the Democrats. That hasn't happened since then. Other presidents have cut taxes, but nobody has actually sat down and made a deal across the aisle to say fairer, simpler, and more effective. And Baker's approach to this was really interesting. So they had a proposal already made by the time he'd become Secretary of Treasury. And he looks at this and said, this is just a loser. This is just cannot pass Congress. It's idealistic, but it will not pass. So he basically decided to throw it out. And he gathers his team every Saturday to sit down and talk about, let's put together a real plan. He puts his cowboy boots up on the table and he's chewing tobacco and spitting in a little, bottle there on the Saturday afternoons. And the people who had developed the first plan noticed what a big change it was, because Baker wasn't talking about in an ideal world, what would a tax code look like? He's saying, wait a second, can this pass? Who would be for this and who would be against this? How would this work? For him, it was about getting things done, not about, as Susan just say, flying your flag and going off the cliff. And so I think that is the ultimate expression of that, because there's so many interests involved, not even just partisan, not even just Republican and Democrat. Think of all the, the oil industry, the real estate industry, the retail industry, all of the different businesses that had something at stake, not to mention the individuals and the families that also were affected by this. So to be able to pull that together and make it a bipartisan thing where it passed almost unanimously in the Senate, that tells you something.
It's incredible. And I think another very interesting fact in the book, I didn't realize myself, because we always think as vice presidents and they're hoping or thinking they might have a chance to be president themselves. But as you both note, before Bush, the most recent vice president to become president was 1836 in Van Buren. Can you talk about how it was that Baker ran Bush's campaign? Bush, who is not a typical retail politician. He doesn't have the charm or the charisma of Reagan or Clinton or something like that. But how it was they ran the campaign, but also with the agreement, I think, gentlemen's agreement between the two of them that, okay, George, I'll do this for you, but if you win, I really want to be a statesman and take it from there.
Yeah, look, there's no question that throughout his time at the Heights in Washington, Baker yearned to escape that label of being merely a political fixer, a handler. He was very, very good at it, but he didn't want to keep doing it. He wanted to be a principal in Washington Parliament. He wanted to be someone who earned the seat at the table in his own right and wasn't just the guy in the pinstripe suit whispering into Ronald Reagan's ear. And so he was Secretary of the Treasury when he's called out of that role, and he really flourished in that, by the way, which again is, to me, kind of remarkable, given that he had no more than an undergraduate economics course at Princeton, where he probably didn't do very well either at that. No background in finance, no Wall Street, nothing. But he, in particular, I think, liked the international negotiation piece of it. And, it's sort of forgotten today, but one of the things he did in addition to tax reform in that role as Treasury Secretary was something called the Plaza Accords, which was the very first time that central bankers around the world essentially agreed to coordinate their macroeconomic policy, which is a very big deal in that world and is sort of foundation of the international economic system to come. That was a sort of precursor of the kind of globalized trade age that we live in. And so Baker really liked operating on this much more expansive playing field. And so he was very reluctant, but he knew he had to come and run Bush's campaign. But, politics wasn't the 4 years long slog that it is today. And, he actually did not come in to run the campaign until the Republican convention. He sat out the primaries from his Treasury Secretary job. He and Bush went camping in Wyoming during the Democratic convention that year. But there was a big problem. And the problem was that Michael Dukakis was killing Bush. In fact, he was up by 17 points, in part because of the fatigue of 8 straight years of the Reagan administration and Republican rule. And Baker looked at this and he understood that there was actually only one way for Bush to win. And it was a negative, even a scorched earth campaign to destroy the reputation of the Democratic candidate. And he did so. And he did so unhesitatingly. And they turned a mild-mannered technocrat from Massachusetts, who was more or less a centrist, into an unpatriotic, hater of the Pledge of Allegiance, ACLU card-carrying, member who somehow liked hardened criminals like Willie Horton. And, this was a permanent mark on Baker's record that tells you a lot about his approach to politics, scorched earth. And when we asked him late in life, do you have any regrets? He volunteered that that 1988 campaign, in particular the Willie Horton ad, might be one of them. Although he then quickly backpedaled and sort of said, no, but in the end, he was comfortable with it. But interestingly, the footnote here is that Baker's version of politics was super hardball. But what did he do immediately after the election when Bush named him Secretary of State? The very first thing he did was to sit down with Jim Wright, the Democratic Speaker of the House from Texas, and to cut a bipartisan deal to end the long-running U.S. support for the Contras and essentially to take off the table perhaps the most divisive foreign policy issue of the Reagan years.
Yeah, and he didn't get a full 4 years. I guess got 3 3/4 as Secretary of State because he kind of got brought in reluctantly at the end to run the campaign for '92. There isn't time to touch upon all of it, but probably hard to imagine any Secretary of State outside of perhaps what happened in World War II having to deal with more on his plate. You mentioned, concluding Americans' wars in Central America. In 1989, Tiananmen Square happens. You can debate whether or not he went a pragmatic role to not kind of dress down the Chinese for human rights violations. But maybe to get to what he's most famous for is himself and Bush assisting in kind of leading to a peaceful de-escalation and dismemberment of the Soviet Union and the falling of the Warsaw Pact. As you note in the book, Robert Gates, the director of the CIA and later, Secretary of State under Bush and Obama, said in many ways he felt Baker and his counterpart, Soviet Foreign Minister Shevardnadze, were perhaps more important and more crucial than even Reagan and Gorbachev. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, I think there's something to that. I mean, I think that, look, the big forces of history were at work at that time. They were not the result of Americans in the sense that Bush or Baker set them off. But and in fact, Baker is really a stability guy, an order guy. His own aide, Margaret Tutwiler, called him Mr. Caution. It wasn't like he was a revolutionary. But when the revolution happened, what he and Bush did was try to find a way to harness it and bring it in for a safe landing, basically. And it didn't have to end that way. We think today the history is sort of inevitable, but the truth is the Soviet Union could have in that period lashed out. It could have been a much more dangerous situation. They had 300,000 troops in East Germany. They didn't have to let Baker and Bush negotiate a reunification of Germany. And I think that you're right, that's probably the biggest, most important moment on the stage for Baker, is bringing this 40-year twilight struggle to a peaceful end. They didn't rub Gorbachev's nose in it. Baker did make friends with Shevardnadze. He brings him out to Wyoming for this fly fishing trip to seal a bond that really matters. And so when the moment comes, the two of them have a friendship that transcends the normal, rote ministerial talking points. In fact, the beginning of the Gulf War is when Baker and Shevardnadze are having their own fishing trip in Siberia, in Lake Baikal and Irkutsk, and Iraq invades Kuwait. And that moment that Baker says to Shevardnadze, let's denounce this together. And so for the first time in 40 years, instead of taking different sides on any of these proxy wars around the world, they stood together and said, no, we as the two powerful superpowers say, this is not the way the world's going to run anymore. And what a difference that made.
And it's emblematic of what you discussed throughout the entire book. But I think you highlight perhaps maybe in some ways what is most important was Baker was, perhaps from his years as a corporate attorney, I don't know, but was excellent at viewing things and considering things from the other side's perspective. You mentioned that he was keenly aware of the enormous stress both Gorbachev and Shevardnadze were under to deliver reform and deliver it quickly, but also the enormous threat that the hardliners posed. Can you talk about how, I suppose, he and Bush, but also Shevardnadze and Gorbachev had to try and balance all of that to have enough reform to keep people happy, but also the major threat of, say, elements of the Soviet military and the hardliners represented?
Well, that's exactly right. And by the way, there were hardliners in both capitals, which is interesting too. I mean, the truth is that actually Bush and Baker were under enormous pressure from the hardliners in the U.S., especially in the Pentagon and in their own Republican Party. So it's interesting because there were obstacles everywhere really to Baker's diplomacy with the Soviet Union. When it came to German unification, the British and the French were also enormous obstacles. Margaret Thatcher was a deep skeptic both of reunification and of Jim Baker. Of course, the British and the French fought two terrible world wars against Germany. So they were very wary. But inside the Soviet Union, there was a real pressure on Gorbachev and Shevardnadze. And actually, that's where that personal relationship building between Shevardnadze and Baker, I think, was indispensable. Because what happened is that Shevardnadze and then later Gorbachev himself confided in Baker with a candor that was astonishing. In some ways, they may have actually felt more comfortable speaking with the American leadership about the pressures and the problems inside the Soviet Union that they were facing than they were in speaking about that with other Soviet leaders who they might not have trusted. And so you have this fascinating situation where you could argue that, say, in the later years of the Obama administration or the later years of the George W. Bush administration, that we had worse relations with Vladimir Putin and with Russia than actually at the end of the Cold War, when Baker and Bush were on very strong terms with Gorbachev and Shevardnadze. The problem actually was that Gorbachev was not solid in his own leadership of the country. And so, the difference between then and now is that it really was touch and go. And that's where, for example, there was enormous political pressure when there was a crackdown in the Baltic states, which were already clamoring for independence. And in the United States, Bush was getting enormous pressure, political pressure from voters here who knew that the United States had pledged, had never recognized Soviet takeover of the Baltics and, wanted him to side immediately with independence. But had they moved too quickly, that could have, caused Gorbachev to actually fall from power. And so, imagine having to calibrate that in real time. It was really a diplomatic challenge of the first order.
And just because you noted it, maybe just one of you could rather quickly talk about it. There's been some, I suppose, revisionist perspectives from Putin and others. But can you talk about, in reality, what did Baker and therefore Bush actually promise or say to Gorbachev and Shevardnadze with regards to the possible extension to NATO and East Germany? And maybe you could help clarify that point. That wasn't a major point in the headlines back then, but it's something Putin has held on to and is a major point of contention between Putin and the West.
Right. I think that's exactly, we reconstruct this in the book. There is a discussion early on in the negotiation to reunify Germany, in which Baker says something to the Soviets like, we could think about agreeing not to extend NATO's jurisdiction to the old, 1 inch to the east, basically, to the old East Germany. And that sets off alarm bells back in Washington. There's a young Soviet staffer on the NSC named Condi Rice, among others, who say, whoa, wait a second, what are you saying? If you say that you're not extending NATO jurisdiction to part of what would be a unified Germany, you're basically saying they're not really a sovereign country. So they got a rocket off to him, and he began pulling back from that, and he didn't end up using that phrase again. But what you then see is an opportunistic effort by people like Putin to then say, well, the Americans promised this and they promised it. That's not really what happened. If you look at the record, they made a promise to allow the Soviets to take a few years to move their troops out of East Germany, and they weren't going to move NATO troops into East Germany, during this transition. But there was not anything in the final agreement made that said anything about not expanding NATO to the east or taking in other countries. They weren't even really thinking about taking in like Poland and Hungary at that time. But it's a convenient thing for Putin to say. And there is, you can make the argument that they felt like there was an implicit and unspoken commitment, but there's nothing in the writing of that treaty that makes the kind of promise that Putin likes to say the Americans made.
All right, and maybe turn the other kind of major accomplishment. As you mentioned, the Soviet Union has barely kind of ceased to exist, and Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait. Everybody's caught flat-footed. The U.S. and Baker don't really have an appropriate response for a few days because they're trying to figure out what exactly is happening and how real is a threat to Saudi Arabia. But can you talk about how he built, really, if you think about it, since World War II, one of the most incredible military coalitions in modern history? Not only did he get almost all of the major Arab states in the region on board, as you note in the book, this is the first time the U.S. and the Soviets were in agreement for military action since World War II. And on top of all that, he kept Israel from taking active part, even when they were attacked by Scuds, because he knew that would play into Saddam's hands. And to finish it off, the 60+ billion was supposed to have cost. He got 51 million of that paid for. Can you talk about the incredible work and efforts he put into building that coalition and how he kept it together?
Well, you're right to spotlight that, because I think it really shows, it showcases sort of two core principles of American foreign policy as Baker and Bush practiced it. Number one was a deep-seated belief in alliances, not in acting alone in the world, but that there was a value in and of itself in working together with other peoples, and that you were always stronger for doing so. And it's interesting, we finally, had our first conversation with Secretary Baker today since the book came out, and that was once again, when asked to critique the current state of American foreign policy, that was the thing he mentioned first of all, and and most of all, which was the idea that our alliances, in his view, are sacrosanct and actually are a form of American leadership. So I found that to be, really expressed perhaps most fully in the Gulf War. The second thing that's interesting is that, it really was President Bush himself, who was, quite adamant in the end about this needing to be, a military operation, and they weren't just going to sit around and talk Saddam to death. Baker's instincts were much more cautious even then about the use of military force, and have remained so today. He obviously was a skeptic later of the 2003 Iraq invasion. He was really an opponent of that. He was a supporter of the Gulf War, the first Gulf War, but very wary. And I don't know, if he had been president and not his good friend Bush, I don't know whether he would have gone in the direction of military action. And yet, once it was decided upon, he was, once again, the indispensable man in making it happen. I mean, they were actually worried at one point it was going to be the first war ever to turn a profit. He was so good in his shuttle diplomacy and literally flying around the world, ginning up contributions for this remarkable coalition.
And maybe that's a good point to kind of take it. We don't have time to go through everything. As you note, reluctantly, he's brought in to run a teetering campaign and for the last 10, 12 weeks of the campaign in 1992. It doesn't work out, obviously, but obviously he's achieved his role of statesman. But a lot of people have always wondered, you address it multiple times in the book, had he thought about more and had he considered it? He was not a natural, baby kissing politician. I think his friend Dick Cheney, I don't remember the exact line you have in the book, but said something like he's the best campaigner you've ever seen, unless he's campaigning for himself, something like that. But from talking to him, how much did he consider actually running at some point?
Yeah, he ran, of course. The only time he ever runs for office is in 1978 in Texas, right, for state attorney general, and he loses. It's still a Democratic state at that time. He's running as a Republican. But he learned, I think, that it wasn't necessarily his most natural, skill set to kiss babies and do backslapping. we interviewed the Houston Chronicle reporter who covered that race back in 1978. He says, yeah, he would go through these Texas state fairs and he wouldn't stop and introduce himself and shake hands and say, hi, I'm Jim Baker running for Texas. Instead, he would head to the back end, find the county judge who was the real power broker in the area and try to figure out, what he should do to make that person on his side. That's the way he operated, right? It wasn't retail, it was wholesale. And he does think about running in 1996 for president. I think he, like a lot of people who work for presidents for a long time, eventually come to the point where they say, well, gosh, they see the people who do it. I could do this. I'm as smart as that guy. Why shouldn't I be president? But I think that he wasn't in the end, that wasn't suited for him. He would have been maybe a very good president, but maybe not a very good campaigner. And we asked him one time, we had a sit down with him and his wife, Susan, who's just amazing. And we said, well, why didn't you run in 1996? He says, well, I was tired. I'd been in high office now for 12 years at this point, and I was ready to relax a little bit. And Susan kind of, interrupts and says, well, wait a second. He says, the party had moved away from you. You were thought of as too liberal, which I thought was a much more realistic assessment of where things were. This is the Gingrich era, and the Gingrich party didn't have a lot of time for a Jim Baker kind of Republican. They were looking for a revolutionary, not the kind of solid figure that Baker was.
Well, and by the way, one interesting postscript, especially for your, Houston audience here, he lost that campaign in a way that certainly benefited his future career. Yeah. He might never become Secretary of State had he not lost that race. But interestingly, he did hold a grudge. And actually, he openly confessed to us when we found out about this, that he, many, many years later, when he was Secretary of the Treasury, he actually inserted a provision into that famous 1986 tax reform bill that forced the owners of the Houston Chronicle to sell the newspaper because he was still angry that his hometown paper had not endorsed him in that 1978 Attorney General race. So, he was a hardball politics.
He specifically told us, he says, I don't get angry, get even, right?
Yeah. and because your book does such a wonderful job of really following Baker up to the present day, he remains kind of a sage source of wisdom for many, many Republicans, for decades. Maybe just briefly you could talk about it. I suppose it's reflective of what his true goals and focus was. He perhaps might have felt a bit, that he had, I don't want to say it was making something up to the Bush family, but the 92 campaign didn't go the way he wanted. He wasn't as committed as he wanted. But in a lot of ways, maybe made up for it, because people may not remember, he was the lead bulldog, basically, for the Florida recount. And it, I think, also says something about him, that he could be cordial and committed, but when he had to be, he could also be, very aggressive and, kind of matter of fact and just get things done.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. He's got a courtly manner, but you don't want to be on the other side of the table if he's got something to win. And that's exactly what the Democrats discovered. We interviewed Democrats who were involved in that Florida recount. They all told us, yeah, when we knew Jim Baker was put in charge of the Republican side, we knew we were probably going to lose. And the very first meeting he has when he gets to Florida is with Warren Christopher, another former Secretary of State, the Democrat. And Christopher is very earnest and has this sort of, we're going to sit down in Geneva and negotiate a nuclear arms treaty kind of approach to this thing, thinking we two wise men will settle the nation's problems here. We'll figure out a way to do this. And Baker's like, no, I'm not here to negotiate, Chris. My guy won. I'm here to make sure he preserves his victory. And that was really the way Baker, look, he was a competitor. He was in it to win. Now, he was very ruthless and tough, a knife fighter in campaigns. But as Susan points out, then when it was over, and he believed in governing. And that was sort of the difference then today. And I think the other difference I would say on Florida, a lot of people are still upset about Florida. A lot of people think Florida was a case study in a dysfunctional democracy. But imagine what it might be like this year, where we have a president who is already questioning the legitimacy of the election that hasn't even happened yet, and saying that the whole thing is going to be rigged and we can't trust the system. Baker, whatever else you think of him, as well as Al Gore, as well as George W. Bush, the main players in that drama had a respect for the system. And when the decision was made, even if they didn't like it, they accepted it and said, this is the system and we now move on. Gore gave a very gracious concession speech. Bush gave a speech reaching out to the other side. And they try to put it behind them. And that's what I think is different about then and today.
And maybe lastly, before we get to the audience questions, he says repeatedly, I'll let people read the book to find out who he voted for in 2016. you mentioned how father voted for Hillary Clinton and George Bush, 43, did not, I suppose, selected no one. But he says, it's for him, it's party above everything. And he says, I am a conservative. I've been a lifelong conservative. That is why I will support the Republican Party. But I know we were delighted to host him maybe 6 years ago. And one of the audience questions was, what do you think Reagan would think of today's Republican Party? And he said, I don't think Reagan would recognize the party. Related to what we opened up about, that, Watergate in some ways was a cleaning of a lot of the top levels of Republicans, or at least for some of them, it put a level of a mark on some of them and allowed maybe a younger generation like Jim Baker to come up. Where do you see the Republican Party today? And if Bush loses, obviously, he may or may not accept the results easily and move on easily. But is Bush and a populist nationalist kind of focus of the party where it is now? Or do you think there's enough of a core element of kind of Bush-Baker type Republicans that could be the Republican Party again going forward?
It's a really good question. I mean, does Trumpism outlive Trump? And I do think, we'll have part of the answer in just a few weeks. But there is already pre-existing evidence to suggest that we're undergoing another shift of sorts, a structural shift in the makeup of the two parties, and that Trump may prove to be an accelerant of that shift. Essentially, you have, a pretty yawning gap right now. That is likely to be the case, even though we don't know the results themselves. But you have an enormous demographic and cultural shift and resorting of the parties, akin almost to the Republican Southern strategy that turned Jim Baker from a Democrat into a Republican, and Texas from a Democratic state into a Republican state. You now, of course, lots and lots of talk about, is Texas itself turning purple? That's been a little bit maybe overblown in some previous elections, but demographic shift would suggest that's happening. And then there's also the cultural shift, the gap between what college educated voters believe about the current president and what non-college educated voters think about the president is overwhelming, and it looks to be much wider even than it was in 2016 when that was already apparent. The gender gap. You have a situation where women right now in public polling are expressing radically different preferences than men, that might even reach not just double digits, but in some surveys, you're already looking at them as much as 20 points different. A gender gap like that is something we've never seen in a national election. And then there's just the simple the political geography of the United States, which suggests that, if you're in a densely populated city of over 100,000 population, over 250,000 population, you're pretty much a Democratic voter at this point. And that, by the way, was already true in the Obama versus Romney election. And so I think we're seeing a resorting of America, and Trump's ideology, of course, of sort of nationalist populism is a better fit, for those who remain behind in that Republican Party. The problem is that's not a majority party. And so there's likely to be at some point a reckoning among those Republican leaders who remain about whether they want to be the party of the 40%. Or not going forward, and that's not going to be Jim Baker's struggle. That will be for those who follow after him.
And just a related question then from the audience. Now, Sue asks, why is he still openly supporting Trump, given he's a man of principles? Colin Powell is openly expressing his views.
Yeah, it's a good question, and we spent a lot of time talking about him with this. A lot of time talking with him about this over the last 5 years, because he obviously doesn't particularly like Trump. He doesn't particularly respect Trump. He is in some ways the un-Trump, right? I mean, Baker used phrases like crazy and nuts and so forth with us. He was offended, I think, by the bombastic, circus-like quality of the White House. He tried to help guide Trump by giving him a 2-page, advice sheet in 2016 that Trump promptly threw away. And he helped get Rex Tillerson named Secretary of State, hoping that would help guide Trump once he was in office. And Rex Tillerson didn't make it for very long, obviously. But, when we talked to him today, he says, look, at one point last year, he told us, well, I think I could vote for Biden. He was that turned off by by Trump. But then he kind of came back and said, well, I'm not ready to give up on my party, even if my party has left me. And you're right. He would say it's not about party, but it's about conservative, right? That I like conservative judges and deregulation and taxes. But I actually do think it's also about this tribal moment in our society when we pick sides. And we're sticking with our side, even if we don't particularly like the leader of our side. And his story is a story of a lot of Republicans, I think, right now.
Well, and look, what I would say is that it's interesting we're getting all these questions because, of course, for 5 years, we were sort of asking the same question over and over and over again about Trump. And I think finally we came to realize that rather than expecting a different answer, if your subject of your biography is telling you who he is, you need to listen to him. And in the end, our book it's a case study in power. It is not a celebration of power, right? And, this is a man who was a practitioner of the art of power politics. And I think in the end, what it tells you is that the advisor to Republican presidents in his biography, that the word Republican meant an awful lot to him.
Great answers, both of you. A lot for people to think about. Just a different question, interesting one from Orlando asks, given his high-profile role in the run-up to the Persian Gulf War and the attempts on George Bush from Saddam, were there ever any close calls for James Baker, either during or after his time in office?
Not that I know of, no. I don't think we've heard anything like that. He was on the trip where Bush was in theory targeted when Bush went to Kuwait after leaving office, and they were celebrated for their role in liberating Kuwait. And Baker was on that trip, but I don't think that Baker had any other moments where he felt a security threat.
His closest call was actually on flying the Secretary of State's plane one time when it almost crashed. This was a really old plane. It was actually, I was fascinated to learn this. It was actually the same plane that had been used as Air Force One for President Kennedy. And actually it was the plane that was on that famous day of November 22nd, 1963. It was the plane that LBJ was flown back to Washington on and took the oath of office on. It was really old by the time it became the Secretary of State's plane. And he told us that one time it scared the crap out of him and they almost plunged into the Pacific Ocean.
Oh, I know the hazards you don't think about. You had enough already. Someone asks interesting question related to kind of what we've discussed already. Who do you think Secretary Baker would consider the likely Republican figures or heirs in, I suppose, if there was to be a Bush-Baker former Republican Party brought back? Huntsman, Kasich,
That's a good question, actually. In 2016, obviously, he supported Jeb Bush, who was the son of his best friend. So that's not surprising. Before Jeb jumped into the race, there was sort of a moment, not for very long, but he kind of flirted with Rand Paul. Not because I think he agrees with Rand Paul on a lot of things, but he was tired of the wars. And he told us, we were out and visiting him at his ranch in Wyoming one day. I very vividly remember him just saying, no more wars. He just thought that America was too involved in these military quagmires overseas. So that, I think, was an area where he was thinking about. But I don't know that there's an obvious Republican new generation figure that he would embrace at this moment.
I mean, if you listen to the things that he told us just today in the interview, what he considers to be core principles, I would say that he is a Kasich Republican who just hasn't quite managed to get to the never Trump part of it. Essentially what he lists are things like the deficit bomb that he sees. And of course, that's a big issue for Kasich, and a form of internationalism that involves both alliances and free trade. Again, I would say that's much more of a kind of middle America Republicanism.
You might like a Paul Ryan or somebody like that.
But even Paul Ryan is a little bit more of a kind of domestic policy innovator. So I probably Kasich is the closest example. But again, look, he's 90 years old. He's reflecting upon the lessons, and the things that worked in the 1980s and 1990s. And that's why our book in the end was about a period of time that is in the past, that is definitively over for the United States.
Another interesting question. Someone asks, says, this book is a very good balanced portrayal of Secretary Baker. What areas was Baker most hesitant to discuss?
That's a great question, and thank you for that. We started this book 7 years ago, and we approached Secretary Baker to see what his level of interest in cooperating would be. And the truth is, he opened up to us. He gave us complete and total unfettered access to his archives at Princeton and at Rice University. He gave us papers that weren't in those archives. He sat down with us every time we asked for time with him. He made possible for us to interview anybody in his life. We interviewed all 8 of his children, his wife, his cousin before his cousin passed away, as well as former presidents and vice presidents and all that. And I would say one of the things we were surprised was he lived up to his end of the bargain. From the beginning, he says, look, guys, I'll answer all your questions. I'm not going to try to hide anything from you. I'm up for warts and all. He understood that it was not an authorized biography, but one that he was willing to cooperate with. And I say 7 years, he lived up to that. He never once tried to say, I don't want you to write about that. I think that's too personal, or I don't agree with your, even looking into it. He never really shied away, including difficult times in his own family. The tragedy of his wife dying and the merger of his family with the next wife, Susan Baker, was a hard moment. They talked about all of that.
And maybe just foreign policy-wise, just related to what they're asking, did you ever get any sense of areas where you might have had regrets? You touch upon Tiananmen Square in '89. It's not a major component because the Bush administration chose basically to, give China a slap on the wrist. But did he ever think, or did you ever ask him, maybe if China had been broached at that point, 30 years ago with regards to human rights, they still might be an economic juggernaut, but we might not be looking at as big an autocratic threat as we have in President Xi now?
That's a really good and insightful question. I would say my answer would be a little bit different than Jim Baker's answer on the foreign policy side. I would point to Tiananmen and also to his essentially disregard for the emerging wars in the former Yugoslavia and the Balkans as the 2 areas of real black marks on his otherwise very strong resume as Secretary of State. What he would say on Tiananmen is that it was essentially, this was Bush's patch. Bush had been the U.S. envoy to Beijing. He called him at one point the desk officer for China, and that their strong instinct was just to get through it and move on. Now, what Baker would say is Middle East peace, because he felt that he took that credibility and leverage that the United States had in the wake of its success in the Gulf War against Saddam, and in the region, Baker, who had initially been reluctant to tackle the thorny and intractable problem of Middle East peace negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians, Baker said, no, now's the moment, and I'm going to do it. And he put together the Madrid Peace Conference. But even then, that was talking about talking. And I think he saw that as a first step toward what he envisioned in the second term as being a full-throated effort to come to a final settlement between Israel and the Palestinians. And we all know they didn't get that second term. Bill Clinton came around to that point of view, but too late. Bill Clinton came in talking about economics and domestic politics. The very last thing he tried to do in his presidency was to make that deal that frankly was the same deal that Jim Baker hoped to make, and both of them just didn't quite get there.
Great answer. I think 2 great places to look at. The book discusses obviously the Madrid talks and everything with Israel and Palestine in great detail and all the related characters. Just maybe a great way to end this. It's not an easy question. It's something you talk about in the book, but Richard asks, what do you think Baker's legacy will be? Maybe in the biggest, fullest way you could put it.
Well, I think, we talk about how he ran 5 presidential campaigns. He was Reagan's chief of staff, and he set the gold standard for that. But I think the things that he is proudest of are the things he did when he was Secretary of State. I think that the idea of basically managing the change in the world was a pretty big thing. If you were to ask him, I think he would talk about that. That when he wrote his memoir, the first memoir he wrote was about his 4 years as Secretary of State. Basically didn't deal with the rest of his life, didn't deal with his time in politics. Later wrote a second memoir when they convinced him that he should about his time in politics. But what he cared about was the statesman role that he played, ending the Cold War, bringing about unification of Germany, bringing the Arabs and the Israelis together, as Susan just mentioned, and prosecuting the Gulf War with an international coalition. I think he feels that he was there at a hinge point in history and played a pretty important role in helping the United States through that.
Well, I want to thank you both again so much. I highly recommend this book, especially for our Houston audience. It's a great way to learn part of our own history. The first few chapters, you've taken us all the way back to kind of almost the founding of Texas with the great-grandfather, and all the way through what they did and developed, to get up to the point where Baker was born. And then since then, just the meteoric rise and the incredible achievements they had, and in a lot of ways, one of the most fascinating people in Washington, probably in many, many generations. I just wanted to remind you guys again, on our website and all the promotions we've sent, we do have 3 links for the book through Amazon and Barnes & Noble. And then also there's another link as well here for Brazos Bookstore, the local bookstore. I would love for you all to support them. And Peter and Susan, I want to thank you all so much. Hopefully we'd love to have you for your next book. I know it could be another good few years. You don't have to give us any hints of what it might be, but thank you all so much. And please, all of you go out there and get this great book. And we love having you, and all the best. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much.
Ronan,
it was great to talk.
We'll be faster this time.
Not 7 years. Not 7 years.
Thank you all so much, and have a great rest of the night. Thank you.
Have a good night, everyone.
Have a good evening.
Thank you. Bye.